Hello, I'm John Eldredge, and welcome to the Ransomed Heart audio podcast. For more information on Ransomed Heart Ministries, our resources and events, please visit us online at www.ransomedheart.com. Friends, welcome back to the Ransomed Heart podcast. I'm John Eldredge here with Craig McConnell. So glad that you're joining in. This podcast concludes a series that we've been pursuing over the last many weeks on relationship styles of relating, what it looks like to love. Last week's loving an evil person, very difficult. Time flew by. We were shocked that our time was up when Art, our producer in the studio, was saying, hey, you guys got to wrap this up. And we felt like we were just getting going. So if you weren't listening in on last week, we wanted to refer you to Dan Allender and Tremper Longman's book, Bold Love. Today, the last podcast, I want to talk about loving a fool as opposed to an evil person, where we were describing an evil person as someone who is consciously and intentionally doing repeated harm, furious or vengeful when confronted. Contrast that with a fool who is far more the self-centered, sort of narcissistic individual, absolutely rejects any kind of discipline, hatred of exposure, understanding. I mean, a fool is someone who is blundering through life, doing damage, as opposed to the evil person who is consciously and intentionally doing it. If you were listening in last week, we were at the top of the recording, we were both laughing about a story we had read in the chapter Loving a Fool in Dan's book. And I have to read this to you because this will really get the conversation going. What Dan says is, what does it mean to get out of the way of a fool's folly? The essence of love is not foolhardy sacrifice, but judicious, well-planned disruption. The fool must be caught so far out in the open, so obviously violating the relationship, that he is forced to take a momentary break, right, in order to pull up his pants after the exposure. Exposure involves forethought, planning, acceptance of the likely loss of relationship that might be temporary or, sadly, long-term. And so here's the story he tells. One woman I know used to endure her husband's rude and abusive humor at social gatherings. After much reflection and thought, she decided to wage a war of love against him. One night at a party, he was on a roll with degrading remarks about women. She finally spoke to the group of men standing around him. She looked in the eyes of one man who had 2 daughters and said, "John, if your daughters were here, would you put up with his rude and unkind remarks?" The whole group grew somber and tense. Her husband was furious, but for a moment, quiet. She looked in his eyes and said, "I think you at least owe an apology to the men who have daughters, who ought to be offended, and if they are not, are as boorish as you." She had not been harsh, although she spoke with great strength and conviction. He was mortified. And the men who had quietly acquiesced to his foolish machinations were equally silent. She had known for some time that his foolishness and hateful critiques of women surfaced most often in social settings, so she had been prepared to launch her attack of bold love at the party. She had also made prior arrangements for another way home, if she should need it, and had a plan to deal with his rage if he chose to come home that night. She was aware that her, quote, betrayal would be the beginning of the end. It would either lead to increased rage and shaming abuse or to a reformulation of their relationship, where he was invited to deal with his extreme harm.
React to that, John.
Oh, it's just so awesome. It's so awesome. I love the courage of that. I love the courage of loving well. I just am so embarrassed by how I don't love, I ignore. I don't love, I avoid. I don't love. I mean, why am I silent? Why do I in situations where I'm very aware of a fool's sin, I'm very aware of their damage they're either doing to me or to maybe a group of people at dinner or to a church. And rather than saying something, I just, avoid it, walk away, pray that God would deal with them. And I love her courage. Yeah. I just love the courage of enough is enough. Not in rage, not in malice. I'm going to expose you, fool, so that you have to deal with, what is it? Your arrogance, your self-centeredness. What is it, fool? I mean, a fool is so clearly marked by their refusal to look at their own style of relating. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, fool does damage, not because it's intentional and repeated over time like the evil person, but just because they're just choosing not to look at their life, and to offer exposure is actually love.
Yes. See, I love the idea of exposing someone, but for their repentance and for their growth in holiness, it doesn't come from a heart that is looking for exposing that they might be repentant and redeemed. Love the idea of exposing people and just kind of shaming them. But when the way she did that, you're talking about someone who puts God before all their most precious relationships. I choose to live and relate in a way that may make me vulnerable to great loss and disappointment in key relationships here. Yeah. I mean, she's risking it. Yeah. The beginning of the end.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is crucial. I mean, this is certainly true of loving an evil person. But friends, as you think about loving the fools in your life, one of the key things, of course, is exposure. That are you aware of, David, are you aware of how mean that comment was? Or Judy, are you aware of how shaming your actions are toward our children? That first there's exposure, but it's exposure not to judge, condemn, dismiss. It's exposure in hopes of repentance. Are you even aware of X, Y, Z? Honey, are you aware of how you sulk at family gatherings when you're not the center of attention? Are you aware of your sulking, sweetheart? It's very self-centered. That's kind of first step with a fool is exposure to their style of relating. But then also, I think the feeling the consequences of their style of relating. That this guy at the party is not only exposed, but to begin to feel some consequences of, the loss of relationship with his wife on those conditions, under that kind of terms, I'm not doing it. But also the consequences of their style of relating publicly exposed.
Yeah. Yeah. I have had some experience in being exposed as a fool. A while back, when I was particularly foolish in thinking that I could control my world and that if my circumstances were orderly and under control, my internal world would be orderly and in control. And I used to just nag my wife, Lori, to death about cleaning up, straightening up, keeping things neat. And I was always frustrated because my internal world was a mess. And so I figured if the house is straight and clean, that would get fixed. And I was always ragging on her. And one day, with enormous strength and insight, John, I remember her saying, honey, just as calm and loving as she could, help me understand how you see the house. Could you take me around the house right now and just show me what bothers you? I'd love to see everything that's out of order or not the way you would like. It would help me understand your heart. And I paused. Oh, okay. Her lack of emotion just disarmed me. And so we start walking around the house. And honestly, Jesus cleaned the house up real quick because I go into the room, John, and I couldn't find anything wrong. And I had to offer this piddly little, be nice if the magazines were kind of straightened on the coffee table. I was exposed. There was no substance there was no substance to me. And I remember she was just quiet. I was just hanging out there to dry. I'm making this huge thing and kind of beating my wife up emotionally with not being a great wife over nothing, over something internal. But I was exposed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a horrible feeling.
And yet exposure with an invitation to repentance, to, back into relationship. It's not exposure with an invitation to being expelled.
Yes.
Dismissed, judged, cast out.
Condemnation.
Which
yes.
might be the case with an evil person,
right.
where, exposure to excommunicate is necessary in abusive situations. But with the fool, they're just, they're kind of blundering through life, demanding everyone else accommodate their style of relating. And to love is to expose. To love is to make them feel the consequence of their style of relating. The point that Dan makes is that the fool won't change without pain.
Yeah.
There's got to be some pain in their life. And I mean, just recently, some friends were dealing with neighbors, and these neighbors kind of had a very belligerent way of relating, and they would just dominate conversations. And if you invited them over for dinner, they'd stay for hours, way past their welcome, and and the conversation's always about themselves and mocking, just such mockery of other people's beliefs, values. I mean, I'll put sort of mild chauvinism, racism in the category of the fool. I'd put severe in the category of evil, but just a belligerence and arrogance. And, to say to them, actually, this will be our last time to get together. Here's our experience of relating to you. Here's what it's like to be in your presence. We find you very humiliating, very self-centered. We love to continue to be good neighbors and friends, but actually we won't be having you over again until you're willing to talk about the effect of the way that you relate to people.
Wow.
So loving.
Yeah.
So loving. And of course the shock, the embarrassment, and you may be met by rage. You may be, with a fool, it's almost guaranteed there'll be some level of immediate defensiveness, immediately explaining away and kind of holding your ground, making them feel the pain of the consequence of their style of relating. They've got to feel the pain of it, or the fool has absolutely no intention of repenting.
I think one of the core beliefs of a fool is this belief that life can be comfortable, predictable, controlled, that we can have heaven on earth, isn't it? Isn't that the root of this selfishness and isn't it the insistence that my world function the way I determine or want or believe?
Bingo. And when you don't comply, oh baby, you feel that in the life of a fool. Their readiness to dismiss you or bully you into cooperation to make their life work.
What strikes me as tough about this, John, is, an evil person is a little more easily to recognize.
Exactly.
But the fool, these could be subtle things. It's you and me. It's churchgoers. It's the pastor with some core belief that justifies being so self-centered and not taking any responsibility for actions.
I think that we assume that a lack of self-awareness is excusable in people. And friends, what we're saying is, no, it's not. The fool justifies their lack of self-awareness, and it's what allows them to kind of blunder through, be the bull in the china shop. But a lack of self-awareness is not excusable. Not according to the scriptures, right? Look in your own eye before you try and remove the log in another's and all of that, that to invite a fool to become self-aware. Are you aware of the effect of that comment tonight? Are you aware of your way of handling money with me and the family? Are you aware, to show them, look, I invite you to self-awareness as your way of repenting. Huge, just huge. And again, we're out of time and so much more to say. We do want to encourage you to read Bold Love by Dan Allender and Tremper Longman. But Craig, you had some thoughts maybe as we wrap up this whole series that I thought would be really good.
Yeah, John, just a couple things as we bring this in for landing. It seems like it's prudent to recognize that life this side of the fullness of the kingdom, this side of heaven, is inevitably going to involve disappointment in relationships.
In any relationship.
Yes. With your closest, most intimate, to the people out there on the street, you will be disappointed.
Children that you love and adore, there will be disappointment.
Mm-hmm. Fools are inevitable. They can't be avoided or predicted and stepped around, and so is evil. It's inevitable in relationships and in this world. And I think the healthy, the person walking with God acknowledges the pain, the hurt, the wounding, the realities of life and relationship, and doesn't withdraw, neglect, disengage, nor do they react in anger, spite, control, and nagging. But there's this path of walking with Christ where I love. I may not enjoy you, but the command to love is true, guides my life, and the blessing of pleasure, the blessing of enjoying you, it's a blessing, it's an add, it's gravy. We're called to love. And ultimately it comes down to what kind of person do I want to be? A loving person, or one who just kind of responds and rebounds and reacts to those around me?
I want to be that person, and I want to share the fruit of this series for me in two very practical ways. One, in relating to my children. I have adult sons now, and it's different than when they were young, and it takes a higher level of intentionality, allowing and honoring for their adulthood, but also not backing down when some things need to be said that might be awkward, that might create tension. And I just think too often I choose the easiest route in relationship instead of the loving route. Another example would be in an email to a difficult person this week. And I wrote one email, and it was just passive. It was just dismissive. It was, how can I get out of this communication as quickly and easily as possible? Just overlook things. And then I just felt like, no, who's that helping, John? What's that done for anyone? And went back, rewrote the email, not in anger, not in judging, but just with a much more conscious awareness of, I'm going to love better here. I'm going to handle this with more cunning, but I'm also going to handle this with much more intention than just kind of duck and run approach to things like that. So we hope this has had fruit in your life, friends. Thanks so much for listening in. As you know, so much more to offer you on our website at ransomedheart.com or on our Facebook page as well. You've been listening to John Eldredge and Craig McConnell, and with this we conclude our series on relationships.